The mysterious disappearances of teenagers in Midtown, a small and seemingly quiet suburb tucked away in the Midwest, was known for its unremarkable charm. Picturesque streets lined with modest homes, local diners opened since the late 50s, and friendly faces were the hallmark of this community. Residents enjoyed the kind of life that felt familiar, safe, and predictable. But all of that began to change 2 years ago when teenage boys started disappearing without a trace. The first case occurred one warm summer evening in June. 17-year-old Brandon Parker, quarterback of the high school football team, waved goodbye to his mom before heading to his friend's house to play video games. He never made it there. At first, the police suspected foul play, but with no witnesses, no ransom demands, and no evidence, their investigation hit a dead end. Brandon's family and friends plastered his face on every telephone pole and storefront in Midtown, hoping for a miracle. None came. Weeks stretched into months, and the town tried to move on, brushing aside whispers of something darker lurking beneath the surface. Then, one September evening, another boy vanished. 15-year-old Caleb Stevens, known for his love of comic books and skateboarding, disappeared while heading home from the local arcade. His skateboard was found abandoned at the foot of a hill near an empty construction site. Investigators found tracks leading away from the site, but they were quickly lost in the dense forest lining the outskirts of Midtown. As the months turned colder, the disappearances cast a shadow over Midtown's postcard-perfect image. Parents began to grow uneasy, enforcing curfews and driving their children everywhere. The town's police department, unused to dealing with such crimes, struggled to connect the dots. Some chalked it up to runaway teenagers. Others theorized human trafficking or even cult activity. Midtown was not used to being the center of mystery or tragedy, and the growing fear among its residents threatened to shake the core of the community. But the cases didn't stop. By the time spring arrived, 4 more boys had vanished, all under the age of 21. Each one disappeared under seemingly ordinary circumstances. Heading out to meet friends, walking home from the library, or simply going for a late-night snack run. Despite heightened security measures and increased neighborhood watch patrols, the pattern remained unsettlingly consistent. Rumors began to swirl, as they do in small towns. Some pointed fingers at a drifter who had been spotted in the area, while others whispered about dark secrets hiding in the woods that bordered the town. No rational explanation seemed to fit. There was no clear evidence, and worse, there were no bodies. It was as though the teenagers had simply vanished into thin air. Sheriff Michael Huffman, a veteran officer in his late 50s, understood the weight of the situation. Midtown reported half a dozen missing teenagers in the span of 8 months. That's not normal for a town this size, he stated in a press conference. His department ramped up their efforts, working alongside surrounding counties to scour nearby fields, forests, abandoned buildings, and even hidden creeks. But the search yielded few clues. By summertime of the second year, 9 teenagers had vanished into the void, leaving behind grieving families and a community teetering on the brink of paranoia. Churches organized vigils where residents lit candles and prayed for the safe return of their missing youth. Posters of smiling, youthful faces were taped to every storefront and handed out during neighborhood meetings. For a town that once felt idyllic, Midtown now wore the scent of fear and grief. Reports of the missing teenagers even spread beyond Midtown, attracting journalists eager to sensationalize the stories. Morning talk shows speculated endlessly about serial killers or trafficking rings. While some residents embraced the national attention in hopes of finding answers, many grew frustrated with the lack of progress. "We don't need cameras or gossip," one local preacher declared at a town meeting. "We need justice, and someone willing to end this nightmare." Parents were haunted by lingering questions. Had they missed the warning signs? Could they have done more to protect their children? But there were no clear connections between the teens. Most came from loving families. They weren't, for the most part, troubled teens or involved in risky behavior. They were simply boys who had gone missing on nights that felt like any other. Then came the turning point. In the winter of the second year, a 16-year-old boy named Jack Miller stumbled into a convenience store just after midnight, his clothes torn and his face bruised. Disoriented and trembling, he gasped out that he had escaped somebody who had tied him up and tried to kill him. The store clerk called the police, and in a single night, Midtown's darkest secrets began to unravel. Jack's story painted a horrifying picture. He was lured by a stranger he met at a local gaming cafe. The man, posing as a friendly construction worker, offered Jack a job helping unload equipment just outside town. Trusting the man's demeanor, Jack had agreed. Heavy snowfall was forecasted that night and Jack figured he could use some extra cash to save up for a car. Instead, Jack was driven toward the edge of town to an old abandoned house hidden behind an overgrown fence. What followed was a blur for Jack. The man tied him to a strange wooden frame, gagged him with fabric strips, and spoke cryptic, unsettling words about controlling life and death. Jack described how he managed to loosen his binds while the man left the room. With sheer adrenaline, he escaped through a broken window under the cover of darkness, running barefoot through the snow until he reached the store. For the first time, there was a survivor, a witness to the horrors unfolding in Midtown. Jack's story brought fresh focus to the investigation and galvanized the town's law enforcement. The mysterious disappearances were no longer unexplained phenomena. They were part of a chilling pattern orchestrated by someone who thrived in the shadows. It was no longer a question of if there was a predator lurking in Midtown. Now the only question left was, how many more had already fallen victim, and how many more did he plan to claim? The elusive predator, the cold darkness within. As the days stretched into years, the once safe confines of Midtown found themselves gripped by an unnamed terror. Whispers of a faceless predator roamed the streets. Who could it be? A drifter? A local? Or worse, someone living among them, walking the same streets, smiling and nodding at neighbors by day, and consuming his dark desires by night. The idea of such a person existing was a chilling thought, but the facts left little room for doubt. Someone out there had been systematically stalking, luring, and killing the town's sons. The predator wasn't just a man, he was a ghost in their midst, a phantom of pure malice hiding behind a thin veil of normalcy. Described by those fortunate enough to escape, the killer wasn't your typical shadowy figure skulking in alleyways. He had an unsettling, almost deceptive normalcy to him, a polite, soft-spoken demeanor that concealed the storm brewing beneath. The survivors described him as unremarkable, mid-30s or early 40s, of average build with an almost forgettable face and a modest appearance. He didn't wear sinister clothing or exude outright menace. Instead, he slipped into conversations with a warm smile and carefully chosen words designed to disarm his victims. He wasn't threatening, not at first, Jack Miller had recalled during his testimony, his voice rattling with unease. He acted like any other guy, like one of my dad's friends, friendly, easygoing. He even laughed at my dumb jokes. I didn't think someone like him could be capable of... Jack paused, his face contorted by the memory of the close call with death. I trusted him. I never thought twice about getting in his truck. This tone of charm wasn't just superficial, it was tactical. To anyone outside his twisted plot, the predator may have seemed like an average man who worked a blue-collar job. He likely paid for his coffee at the town diner, bought parts at the hardware store, or even sat in the back pew of the local church. But his ultimate weapon was his ability to maneuver a conversation into a trap, carefully luring his targets like a spider spinning an intricate web. He targeted boys who were vulnerable, not necessarily because they were weak, but because they trusted too much. Teenagers like Brandon Parker, Caleb Stevens, and others were drawn by promises of money, quick work, or kindness when they perhaps least expected it. He understood the desire many young men had to assert independence, to prove they could earn their keep or snag a little extra to live their next adventure. But instead of helping them grow, he walked them straight into the maw of his sadistic fantasies. What made him even more terrifying was how cleanly he worked in the shadows. For years, law enforcement couldn't pin down any trace of him. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness reports that clearly linked to a suspect. Only vague stories of a man in a beat-up truck. Each act of violence took place in the unnoticed margins of town. Abandoned farmhouses, empty lots, wooded clearings. The scene of the crime changed like clockwork, leaving nothing behind but hollow traces of the lives he erased. Psychologists who were later called in as consultants to the growing investigation labeled him a power-assertive predator, the kind of killer who thrives on the dynamic of dominance and control. Every act revolved around his ability to take charge and reduce his victims to desperation and submission. To those tasked with stopping him, this made him not only dangerous but almost impossible to predict. His entire pattern, the disarming charm, the calculated approach, the precise timing, all felt choreographed, giving the sense that this wasn't his first time playing this demented game. More chilling, however, was his utter lack of purpose outside of satisfying a personal craving for control. Detectives couldn't find any indication that he was after money, revenge, or material gain. He didn't steal valuables from his victims or leave behind messages meant to taunt the police. To him, the kill was its own reward, a grotesque ritual he reenacted over and over. Even his choice of weaponry reflected his carefully constructed persona. This was no brute slasher wielding flashy, attention-grabbing weapons. He favored restraint, dull tools, makeshift nooses, and crude wooden frames he assembled as part of his bizarre rituals. Survivors described being tied up with strips of rough fabric, many of which later matched materials found at nearby hardware stores. He wasn't killing with flair, he was killing with focus and efficiency, as if the act itself were an almost mechanical process for him. FBI profiler Dr. Carol Ridley, who was brought into the case during its escalation, described him succinctly. This isn't someone who lets rage drive him into rash behaviors. He's meticulous, methodical. Every detail matters to him, from who he chooses to where he chooses to do it. The location, the tools, the messages he leaves silently through his victims' bodies, all of it fits a pattern of control. For him, taking a life isn't chaos, it's art. However, what unsettled the profiling team the most wasn't how he killed, but why he stopped, at least in one specific case. Jack Miller's survival wasn't logical. Unlike other victims who were found buried under thin layers of dirt in abandoned backyards, Jack was let go, alive. When confronted about this inconsistency during his eventual capture, the predator responded simply with a chilling answer, "I was finished. I was bored. Maybe I figured it was time to see if they'd finally catch me." Bored. It was the kind of answer that sent shivers down an investigator's spine. It spoke to the lack of humanity within him, how removed he was from any sense of remorse or accountability for what he had done. Boredom wasn't just the reason for sparing a life, it could have just as easily been the reason for the next wave of terror he would have unleashed had he not been caught. As the evidence grew and statements were pieced together, one thing became certain. This wasn't just a murderer with a hobby. This wasn't simply a deviant sadist or gangster with a vendetta. This was someone with a fundamental misalignment of morality. A human being who viewed life as trivial, disposable, and entirely subservient to his desires. To him, people weren't people. They were pawns, toys in a chess game of control. The predator thrived in the corners of obscurity, carefully keeping himself one step ahead of law enforcement while the town grew increasingly paranoid. The elusive ghost of Midtown became a chilling warning to parents, and a rallying cry for a justice system desperate to stop him before more lives were lost. But if he operated in the shadows, who, if anyone, would dare to pull him into the light? The predator's deceptive tactics, a master of manipulation. To the residents of Midtown, the idea of a predatory killer lurking in their midst was as terrifying as it was surreal. This was not a large, bustling metropolis where anonymity was everywhere. Midtown was small, quaint, and familiar, the kind of place where store clerks knew your parents and teachers lived just a few streets away. Yet, for over 2 years, a single man had outwitted everyone, preying on the town's youth with unsettling ease. His ability to blend in and strike without raising suspicion was a reflection not of brute force or overt intimidation, but of cunning manipulation and psychological control. Unlike the villains from slasher movies or crime dramas, this predator didn't rely on fear to subdue his victims. Fear came later. Instead, he approached his targets with charm, confidence, and a facade so meticulously crafted that his victims never saw the danger until it was too late. His entire modus operandi revolved around trust, building it rapidly and exploiting it completely. In many ways, he was less a stereotypical killer and more of a highly skilled con artist, albeit with a grotesque goal. The predator's main hunting grounds were places that many considered safe: gaming cafes, local diners, libraries, bus stops, and even parks. These were public, everyday spaces frequented by teenagers who hung out after school or lingered late into the night. He had no need to stalk them in the shadows. Instead, he would casually strike up conversations, slipping into his role as the helpful stranger with disarming naturalness. Survivors would later describe him as friendly and normal, 2 words that made his actions all the more haunting. Take Caleb Stevens, one of the earlier victims who vanished after a night at the local arcade. Witnesses remembered seeing Caleb talking with a man who appeared approachable. He offered Caleb a ride, claiming his car, a worn-out truck, was parked just around the corner. "He didn't look dangerous," one witness recalled. "No weird vibes or anything, just a guy you wouldn't think twice about." That was the secret to his success. He was always exactly what his victims needed him to be. To a shy kid struggling to fit in, he was the supportive adult offering an ear. To a confident teen eager for independence, he was an enabler promising a quick gig to make extra cash. He shaped his persona to match the insecurities and ambitions of each teenager he encountered, becoming a reflection of their hopes and needs. Many of his victims were boys who came from unassuming middle-class families. Some were restless for adventure, others were simply young and trusting souls with little reason to suspect they might be in danger. The predator knew this, and he exploited those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. One of his favorite tools was the promise of easy money. He pitched this concept with such casualness that it rarely raised an eyebrow. His approach might sound something like this: "Hey kid, you look like a strong boy. My buddies and we've got some renovation work out by the countryside, just a few hours of heavy lifting. Pays you $50 cash. Interested?" He often dangled just enough bait to make his pitch seem plausible, but not so much that it sounded suspicious. It was always simple work: lifting lumber, cleaning equipment, or helping him move supplies. When he really wanted to sweeten the deal, he'd throw in the allure of quick financial freedom. "Easy way to make some pocket change," he might say with a grin. "Gotta start somewhere, right?" For other victims, it wasn't even about money. Instead, he leaned on building rapport. He paid attention to the kids who loitered in gaming cafes, soaking up the conversations around him before carefully stepping in. A well-placed compliment about a video game score or skill was often enough to catch someone's attention. "He told me I was really good at this racing game," one survivor, Jack Miller, remembered vividly. "Said I could probably do anything with hands that quick. Then he asked if I wanted to join him for a side job, helping move some tools. It didn't seem sketchy at all, not until it was too late." Another survivor, Marcus Lane, described how the man used empathy to get close. "He pretended we had a lot in common. He told me he had a rough childhood too, just like me," Marcus explained. "When someone acts like they understand you, you want to trust them. You want to believe that they're on your side." His mastery of social dynamics made him a chameleon. He was the funny, approachable uncle figure to some, while others saw him as a calm and respectful older brother type. But behind the polished facade was something far more dangerous. Once the trust was established and the target was locked in, his demeanor would shift, subtly at first, and then suddenly. By the time his victims noticed the change in his tone or body language, it was already too late. The predator planned each interaction with military precision. First, he would build a sense of familiarity through ordinary conversation, sports, hobbies, school life, or weekend plans. He used shared small-town experiences to form an instant connection. Then, he offered them an enticing opportunity to leave with him. A ride, a job, or even just a chance to visit an interesting place he claimed to know about. The moment they stepped into his truck, they were as good as gone. But his deceptions didn't end there. For those who hesitated or expressed doubt, he adapted quickly, using strategies designed to neutralize any reluctance. If they seemed uncertain, he leaned on the subtle push of guilt. "Oh, don't worry about it, kid. I guess I'll find someone else. Just thought you seemed like you could use a break." If they were nervous about time or travel, he disarmed them with his willingness to accommodate. "It's just around the corner. Won't take more than 20 minutes, tops." His pitch was so practiced, so natural, that few ever questioned him. Even when he started driving to more remote areas, victims rarely panicked right away. He maintained his composed demeanor, providing calmly delivered lies when necessary. "Just taking a shortcut," he'd say, or, "This is where my crew parks their tools." It wasn't until his victims stepped foot inside the abandoned farmhouses or dilapidated sheds that the gravity of the situation truly began to sink in. Many survivors described a chilling transformation once they reached the isolated locations. His cheery tone fell away, replaced by a cold detachment. He no longer spoke to them as though they were people, instead issuing sharp commands that turned them into mere objects of control. "It was instant," one survivor recounted. "One minute he was friendly, the next he had a strip of cloth in his hand, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe." What made his tactics even more unnerving was the calculated efficiency with which he executed each step. There was no doubt this was a man who had done this before, and planned to do it again. His ability to manipulate, deceive, and isolate his victims without raising alarms was his most dangerous weapon, and it's what allowed him to operate in plain sight. Every encounter was a carefully rehearsed performance, a sick game where he always held the winning cards. The predator didn't just prey on the bodies of his victims, he preyed on their trust, their hopes, and their youth. To him, they were pawns in a much larger, twisted narrative of control and domination. To the rest of the world, however, he was nothing more than a vanishing face in a small-town crowd, smiling in the shadows while he planned his next move. The abandoned houses, crime scenes of untold horrors. In Midtown, abandoned houses were more than just forgotten remnants of time. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than relics. A sagging roof here, a broken window there, overgrown yards and rusted mailboxes. To urban explorers, they might seem like another Instagram-worthy backdrop of decay. To local kids, they were places to dare one another to enter under the cover of night, often for nothing more than a cheap thrill. But to the predator stalking Midtown, these houses served an entirely different purpose. They became the perfect cover for his dark rituals, strategic fortresses where no one could hear the screams. Littered across Midtown's outskirts and beyond, these forlorn structures had fallen into disrepair long before the disappearances. Located near wooded areas, empty fields, or forgotten country roads, their isolation made them invisible to most. Sometimes they belonged to families who had moved away long ago, or were tied up in legal disputes that left them unoccupied for years. These houses existed in a kind of regulatory limbo, structures standing but effectively erased from public consciousness, and this was precisely what made them ideal for someone like him. The predator didn't just randomly pick these locations, he sought them out, as if scouting for potential crime scenes to add to his repertoire. During his occasional odd jobs as a handyman or construction worker, he had memorized the geography of Midtown's outskirts like a scavenger with an intimate knowledge of the terrain. He knew where the forgotten dirt paths led, which properties remained untouched for months, and where the overgrowth had completely concealed a once-inhabited home from prying eyes. He operated like a hunter who knew his favorite hunting grounds better than anyone else. A stage for brutality. Each abandoned house became a silent witness to unfathomable horrors. The predator transformed these spaces into what investigators later called makeshift execution sites. Inside, they weren't just empty rooms with peeling wallpaper and warped wooden floors, they were arenas of pain and control. Detectives uncovered all too similar setups. Crude wooden frames built with scrap materials, strips of frayed fabric strewn about, or worn-out tools he used as weapons and instruments of domination. The crime scenes felt less like accidents of opportunity, and more like disturbing workshops for his grim experiments. Investigators would later describe the eerie silence that fell over them every time they entered these homes. It wasn't just quiet, it felt wrong, almost suffocating, like the walls were holding a terrible secret, said Officer Carla Brooks, one of the lead investigators. Some houses had distinctive smells that lingered, the mustiness of damp wood mixed with faint traces of ammonia, copper, and sweat. On more than one occasion, officers found patches of dirt on the concrete floors, hinting at attempts to clean up what couldn't be entirely erased. Detective Jim Harper, who had responded to several house calls, recalled his first entry into one of these sites. "The moment I walked in, I knew this wasn't a random spot where kids might hang out," Harper said. "There was purpose to the way everything was arranged. Tables shoved to the side or flipped, rope marks on the wooden beams above. The empty, hollow echoes of my own footsteps, everything in that house screamed that death had hung in the air there." Perhaps the most chilling discovery were the unassuming backyards of these abandoned properties. In several locations, investigators found areas where the soil looked disturbed, patches of ground flattened or covered haphazardly with debris. Rusted shovels and disused gardening tools were mistakenly left behind in some yards. One officer described stumbling upon a patch of ground surrounded by scattered wood chips and overgrowth, where signs of fresh digging suggested something, or someone, had been buried. Forensics would later confirm what everyone feared: skeletal remains, shallow graves concealed in plain sight by someone who knew no one would care to look. A network of silence. The predator's familiarity with these abandoned locations was not a coincidence. He had turned avoidance into an art form, exploiting every gap in the town's oversight. The owners of these properties were often out of state or unreachable, and neighbors rarely paid attention, dismissing odd sightings or noises with a shrug. These were the kinds of neighborhoods where things simply went unnoticed, not from malice or neglect, but from the natural tendency of humans to avoid what didn't seem to directly involve them. In one particularly haunting case, an elderly resident of Meadow Lane recalled seeing someone pulling a truck into the driveway of a dilapidated house late one evening. "I thought it was a realtor, maybe someone finally trying to sell the place," the man confessed later. "Didn't think much of it, didn't think to report it." Months later, investigators unearthed the remains of two teenagers in the backyard of the same house. Another neighbor, living near an overgrown property at the edge of Pine Ridge Forest, described hearing noises at odd hours of the night, scraping sounds, muffled voices, the dull thud of something heavy hitting the ground. It wasn't until officers spotted fresh patches of dirt behind the house, resembling makeshift graves, that an unsettling realization dawned on the neighborhood. The predator had been there, working right under their noses, a sickening pattern. As investigators pieced together the scope of the predator's actions, a horrifying pattern emerged. Each house told a similar story. The predator would select a site, prepare it with chilling efficiency, commit his acts, and then vanish without a trace. The setups varied slightly from house to house, but all shared consistent elements: wooden frames, fabric strips, and tools repurposed in macabre ways. Forensic teams even found faint bloodstains on walls and floors, areas washed hastily as if to mask but not fully eliminate the traces of his crimes. What unsettled detectives most was the predator's adaptability. When one location grew too risky or attracted attention, he swiftly abandoned it in favor of another. His houses became disposable hideouts in a twisted game of musical chairs. This nomadic style allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement while also revealing the unsettling extent of his planning. This wasn't random chaos, it was a calculated strategy, the actions of a predator who knew exactly how long he could use a space before moving on. Ghostly monuments to violence. To this day, many of the abandoned houses used by the predator remain standing. Even after extensive forensic investigations, their physical structures hold the weight of what transpired beneath their crumbling roofs. In Midtown and its neighboring towns, these properties became taboo, avoided by most who feared the lingering presence of an unspeakable evil. They stood as haunting reminders of the lives lost, a part of the town's history no one wanted to acknowledge but no one could forget. For the families of the victims, the thought that their loved ones spent their final moments in such bleak isolation is almost too much to bear. These houses, silent sentinels to unspeakable violence, mark the contrast between light and darkness, safety and danger, innocence and pure, unbridled malice. And while walls cannot speak, these homes have told their stories in dirt-covered floors, faint blood trails, and the hollow emptiness left behind. A warning hidden in plain sight. The lesson Midtown was forced to learn was that evil doesn't always strike from the shadows. It can thrive in the overlooked corners of everyday life. The abandoned houses, once mundane artifacts of neglect, became sites where trust was betrayed, lives were taken, and monsters were unleashed. In the end, they served not just as crime scenes but as unintentional collaborators in the predator's reign of terror. And even now, those who dare pass by these forgotten homes can still feel the weight of the unspeakable acts that once transpired within their crumbling walls. The lucky survivor, escaping the predator's grasp. It was well past midnight on an icy, unforgiving December night when 16-year-old Jack Miller stumbled into a dimly lit convenience store on the edge of Midtown. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, his shoes missing, and his feet battered from running barefoot through snow and gravel. His entire body trembled uncontrollably, a mixture of frostbite and raw terror gripping him. The night clerk behind the counter recognized him immediately, a boy who everyone thought had vanished into thin air 3 days ago. "Help me! He's still out there!" Jack gasped, collapsing to the floor. That single plea for help shattered the silence of the town and set the stage for unraveling the darkest nightmare Midtown had ever known. The disappearance. Just 3 days prior, Jack had been a regular teenager. He was a quiet kid, not the type to go seeking trouble. An avid gamer, Jack often spent his evenings at a local gaming cafe where flashing screens and the sound of mouse clicks filled the air. That night the cafe had been busier than usual, a mix of teens and adults. Jack had just finished a particularly intense racing game session when he noticed a man sitting nearby, casually sipping coffee while pretending to watch. The man smiled warmly at Jack, nodding in acknowledgement. "Impressive score," he commented. Jack, a little surprised, muttered a polite thanks. Soon the man struck up a conversation, asking Jack about his hobbies, school, and whether he had a job. The man introduced himself as Mitch, a construction worker who frequently did renovations just outside of Midtown. He talked about needing an extra hand for a quick job, unloading some equipment. "It's nothing serious," Mitch assured Jack. 2, maybe 3 hours of hauling stuff. $50 cash, easy money for a kid saving up for, I don't know, a new console? Initially Jack was hesitant, but the polite demeanor of the man, his casual tone and the offer of quick cash wore him down. "It's only about 20 minutes from here," Mitch added, flashing what seemed like a genuine smile. "I'll drive you back before it gets too late. No big deal." Jack thought it over, weighing the opportunity to make some fast money against any vague sense of unease. By the time they left the cafe, Jack was convinced it would be harmless. The nightmare begins. From the moment Jack stepped into Mitch's beat-up red pickup truck, the air felt different. The radio hummed with soft country music, and Mitch kept the conversation light, but something about the route didn't sit right with Jack. The truck sped past familiar streets and veered onto increasingly desolate narrow roads. When Jack nervously asked where they were headed, Mitch gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Shortcut," he said. It wasn't long before the truck stopped in front of a house that looked more like a haunted relic than a renovation project. The old two-story structure loomed with shattered windows, and the snow-covered yard was littered with overgrown weeds. Jack hesitated, but Mitch brushed it off. "Don't let the outside fool you. We're just unloading some stuff in the back. Let's go." As they entered the house, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air was thick, stale, and carrying a faint metallic tang. Wooden boards creaked underfoot, and piles of discarded tools and materials were strewn across the floor in strange, almost deliberate patterns. Before Jack could process his unease, Mitch's voice became sharper, colder. "Shut the door behind you. We don't want anyone wandering in," he said, his earlier friendliness gone. Jack swallowed hard, gripping his jacket tighter. "What exactly are we doing here?" he asked, his voice edged with nervousness. Mitch didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a roll of fabric strips from a nearby table and moved toward Jack with an unsettling calmness. That's when panic set in. Jack had barely begun to back away when Mitch grabbed him, overpowering him with surprising strength. Within minutes, Jack was gagged, his wrists and ankles bound to a makeshift wooden frame Mitch had crudely assembled in the center of the room. Mitch's demeanor flipped fully now. Gone was the polite man from the cafe. In his place stood a figure cold, methodical, and detached. "You'll learn not to trust so easily," Mitch muttered as he prepared his tools. The escape. For 3 days Jack endured the worst. Bound, hungry, and freezing, he fought to stay calm, convincing himself he had to find a way out. Mitch came and went, speaking cryptically about how control over life and death made him feel alive. He would casually pull up a chair, speaking to Jack as if they were old acquaintances, detailing the control he claimed to hold over his victims. But over time, Mitch grew careless, confident that Jack was too weak to resist. On the third night, Mitch left a loose knot in one of Jack's bindings. Jack worked at it relentlessly, his fingers raw and numb from the friction. Using every ounce of adrenaline in his body, he finally freed himself. Jack knew he had only one chance. Quietly, he edged toward a broken window at the far end of the room. The snowstorm outside had picked up, concealing the sound of his movements. He shattered the remaining glass with a discarded wrench, leaped out into the freezing cold, and ran. The wilderness beyond the house was unrelenting, dense forest coated in thick layers of snow, with sharp branches scratching at his skin. Jack's feet were bare as they pounded against frozen ground, but the rush of escaping Mitch kept him going. Behind him, he could hear faint yelling as Mitch realized he was gone. Jack didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs felt like collapsing, until he saw the dim lights of the convenience store flickering in the distance. A voice of hope. When Midtown police arrived at the store, they found Jack wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot cocoa provided by the clerk. His account of the past 3 days brought a chilling clarity to what had remained an unsolvable mystery for 2 years. Jack's descriptions of Mitch, the friendly demeanor, the red truck, and the abandoned house, gave law enforcement their first tangible leads. For the first time, the faceless predator had a name, a method, and a trail. Though Jack was physically rescued, the emotional wounds ran deep. He struggled with recurring nightmares and a lingering sense of guilt, wondering why he had been allowed to survive while so many others had fallen victim. But in the eyes of the people of Midtown, Jack was more than just a survivor. He was the key to stopping a monster who had terrorized their community for far too long. A turning point. With Jack's escape, Midtown's dark cloud began to crack. For the first time, there was hope that the deadly dance between the predator and his prey could come to an end. Investigators now had something solid, a witness whose courage under unimaginable circumstances provided the first giant step toward justice. And for Jack, while his brush with death would never truly leave him, he became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of fear, survival was possible. The first clue, a relentless pursuit for justice. When 16-year-old Jack Miller stumbled into the convenience store with his harrowing story, Midtown's law enforcement finally had something they could use, something tangible after months of endless dead ends and frustrating speculation. Jack's survival didn't just inspire hope, it shifted the investigation from a desperate guessing game to a precise hunt for answers. What had once been a trail gone cold, now warmed up, ignited by the scars, memories, and testimony of a young boy who had stared into the eyes of the predator and lived to talk about it. Piecing together the predator's profile. Jack's painstakingly detailed account gave investigators their first real insight into the man who had terrorized Midtown for years. Every word, every memory, and every fragmented detail became a piece of a larger puzzle. Led by Sheriff Michael Huffman, a calm but determined man nearing retirement. The local authorities teamed up with profiling experts and criminal psychologists to build their case. What they now had was a rough but shocking description. A seemingly average, polite man working blue-collar jobs, someone friendly enough to charm teenagers but cold and calculating enough to conduct unspeakable acts of violence without remorse. Jack described his truck, a beat-up red pickup with no license plate. He recounted the predator's carefully constructed persona, polite, approachable, and unremarkable to the point that he could disappear into a crowd without a second glance. "When Jack was telling us about this guy's demeanor, you could see the wheels turning in his head," said Detective Jim Harper, a seasoned investigator who had led search and rescue operations around Midtown. "He kept saying, he just felt normal, and that's what scares me. It's not what he looked like that stuck with people. It's how easily he pretended to be a good guy." Armed with this knowledge, the police began combing Jack's description against local databases, checking records of workers, arrest histories, and even deliveries made in the area. Still, a name eluded them. With no DNA to trace or direct witnesses linking to a single individual, it was clear that this man had planned his crimes meticulously. He was completely off the grid or hiding just well enough to make himself invisible. A break in the case. The first real breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A tattered piece of fabric. During one of the searches of abandoned homes on Midtown's outskirts, investigators uncovered strips of material eerily similar to what Jack had described. The makeshift bindings, worn, frayed, and often repurposed from burlap or scraps of industrial fabric, matched Jack's detailed memory of what had been used to restrain him. Attached to one of these strips was a faint trace of dried blood, a possible link to a previous victim. "I'll never forget finding that piece of cloth," said Officer Carla Brooks, who was part of the forensic team on site. "It was tucked under a pile of spent wood in a corner, almost like he didn't care if it was found. That's what was so chilling. It was deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He knew how much time he had." Laboratory testing confirmed what they feared. The blood didn't match Jack's but instead belonged to an unidentified individual, suggesting that Jack's tormentor had claimed multiple victims in that very house and maybe even beyond. This small but critical clue pushed investigators to look closer at these crime scenes, revisiting spots they had previously deemed irrelevant. What else had the predator left behind? Retracing Jack's journey. Guided by Jack's descriptions of the predator's movements, officers recreated his entire journey in painstaking detail. Using Jack's account of the roads taken that night, detective teams traced possible routes leading to the abandoned farm. Jack remembered several landmarks along the way. An old billboard, a broken tractor tucked into the snow, and a narrow dirt path flanked by dense rows of pine trees. Piece by piece, a map began to emerge. The red pickup truck became a central focus. Tips began pouring in from residents who believed they'd seen it before. A farmer just outside the north edge of Midtown recalled spotting the truck parked near an unused barn on his property, but had thought little of it. A school janitor noted that a truck matching the description often idled near the back of the high school parking lot, blending in among construction vehicles. Each of these sightings etched the predator's brazen patterns more clearly. He hadn't just operated in isolated areas, he had been embedding himself in the very fabric of their town, hiding in the plainest of sight. "He knew our rhythms," Sheriff Huffman admitted. "When people got up for work, when streets emptied out late at night, who left their doors unlocked, that's how he got away with it for so long." A chilling discovery. As the manhunt intensified, the townsfolk began mobilizing as well. Neighborhood watch programs became stricter than ever before, parents doubled down on curfews, and local businesses began coordinating to report anything unusual. This vigilance paid off when a jogger stumbled upon something horrifying during his early morning run. Near the town's western boundary, tucked in a small clearing of pine trees, lay another abandoned house. Behind it, investigators found soil that had been freshly overturned beneath a layer of hastily scattered leaves and branches. Upon digging, the officers discovered unsettling remnants: skeletal fragments, pieces of discarded tools, and more fabric bindings. This was no longer a singular private tragedy. It was evidence of a method, a ritual, a serial killer's systematic approach to silencing his victims. "We were looking at a burial ground," Detective Harper revealed later. "We knew we were finding the resting places of his victims. It was heart-wrenching, and we knew this wasn't the first one. We were determined to make it the last." The relentless search. Fueled by these discoveries, coordinated investigations between Midtown PD and state agencies began to close in on possible suspects. Forensic labs worked overtime, analyzing the blood, bone fragments, and fabric fibers from the house and patching every scrap of data into the growing profile of the predator. Lists of local residents with criminal records or suspicious behavior were cross-referenced with sightings of the red truck. Flyers were distributed to small towns beyond Midtown, warning residents to keep an eye out for similar trucks or individuals approaching teenagers with job offers or rides. But it wasn't just about police work anymore. The community, long paralyzed by fear, turned its fear into action. Residents manned phones at the sheriff's tip line, called the authorities over every pickup truck that even remotely matched the description, and organized search teams to scan nearby woods and abandoned properties. Midtown wasn't just a victim, it was fighting back. Hope amid the darkness. Though there were still no arrests yet, hope began to take root alongside the fury and determination. The clues they had painstakingly pieced together gave everyone, the detectives, the families, and the community, a reason to believe the predator wouldn't remain free for much longer. "He thought he was some kind of ghost, disappearing into the night," Sheriff Huffman said. "But ghosts make mistakes just like anyone else. And Jack's escape? That was his biggest mistake yet." The first clue was just the beginning. The predator's web was just starting to unravel, and Midtown had no intention of stopping until it was completely dismantled. The intense manhunt. A community united against evil. The manhunt for the elusive predator that had haunted Midtown for over 2 years became nothing short of a relentless pursuit. No longer was this just a police investigation. It was a coordinated movement driven by the shared grief, rage, and desperation of an entire community. The discovery of the first tangible clues, thanks to Jack Miller's daring escape, had flipped the narrative. The predator was no longer an invisible phantom preying at will. Now, for the first time, he was being hunted. The police mobilized Sheriff Michael Huffman, a veteran of law enforcement with decades of experience, took command of the operation. The long-serving sheriff, known for his calm and methodical approach, understood the magnitude of the task before them. It wasn't just about solving a case. It was about restoring trust and security to a community gripped by fear. "We can't let him keep striking. He's thought he's untouchable for too long," Huffman told his team during a closed-door meeting. "If we don't work together effectively and quickly, we're giving him the opportunity to destroy more lives. That's not going to happen on my watch." The first step was to create a comprehensive task force. Local officers, already stretched thin, were reinforced by agents from nearby counties and the state police. The FBI, now drawn to the case due to its scope and the clear pattern of a serial offender, deployed specialists from their behavioral analysis unit to build a deeper profile of the predator. These elite profilers began working closely with Midtown's detectives, examining every scrap of evidence collected over the past 2 years. "His movements aren't random," said Dr. Carol Ridley, one of the FBI's lead profilers. "He has a pattern that we've only begun to see clearly now. He's calculating, methodical. He spends time in this community because he thrives on familiarity. It's both his greatest strength and the weakness we can exploit." Turning fear into vigilance. Midtown itself turned into a fortress of vigilance. The once quiet streets now bristled with activity as neighborhood patrols sprang up overnight. Volunteers, many of them parents who had lived in terror for far too long, worked side by side with police officers to monitor suspicious movements near schools, parks, and abandoned buildings. Homeowners installed locks, floodlights, and cameras, determined to make their town an inhospitable place for predators. "You couldn't pay me to let my kids walk home alone," said Sarah Jensen, a mother of 3. "We used to leave our doors unlocked. Now I double-check the locks every night. The whole town doesn't sleep until this guy is caught." Flyers were distributed at every corner store and gas station. They featured images of a 16-year-old Jack Miller, a description of the red truck, and warnings to keep an eye out for anyone loitering near places where teenagers gathered. Schools held assemblies to warn students about the importance of saying no to strangers, even those who seemed harmless or offered money. Meanwhile, church groups and community centers organized vigils and support gatherings for families of the missing boys, finding strength in unity. Sweep operations. As the weeks wore on, the police expanded their search radius beyond the boundaries of Midtown. Teams swept through nearby woods, creeks, and abandoned buildings with painstaking thoroughness. Each group carried satellite maps, flashlights, and portable forensic kits to collect any potential evidence that might have gone unnoticed in previous searches. Dozens of abandoned houses were systematically inspected. In many cases, they found even more signs of the predator's activities. Wooden frames stained with rust and blood, discarded tools, and remnants of the fabric bindings, eerily consistent across each location. Officers unearthed shallow graves where skeletal remains told the silent truths of lives taken too young. The growing weight of these discoveries only deepened their resolve to find the person responsible. Detective Jim Harper, leading one of the search teams, described the unsettling nature of the sweeps. Every house felt the same, like stepping into a graveyard made of wood and metal. You knew it wasn't just a house anymore, it was a crime scene, a place where someone's son had died alone. Chasing leads. The search for the red pickup truck reached fever pitch. Tips flowed in from all corners of the region, some credible, others products of paranoia. One caller believed they had seen the truck parked by an abandoned quarry 7 miles from town. Another swore they'd noticed it idling outside a diner late at night. Every lead was carefully analyzed, and any vehicle remotely matching the description was scrutinized. In one instance, officers launched a high-intensity surveillance operation on a mechanic shop where an employee had been driving a red pickup. Though he was eventually cleared, the effort highlighted just how serious the manhunt had become. The FBI played its part by combing through regional databases to pull up records of anyone who owned or had recently sold a red truck. They cross-referenced this with records of individuals linked to crimes such as assault, kidnapping, or harassment. Slowly but surely, they started to narrow the field. The predator slips. The closest encounter yet happened on a bitterly cold January evening. Officers, acting on a tip from a local, set up surveillance on a wooded path where the predator was rumored to have lured one of his victims. For hours, they saw nothing but snowy silence, until a man matching the general description emerged from the woods, walking briskly toward a beat-up red pickup. Law enforcement moved in fast, but the predator was quicker. Sensing the ambush, he bolted through the trees, weaving between thick trunks and vanishing into the dark forest before they could track him. Inside the truck, investigators found a collection of tools, rolls of fabric, and a single notebook filled with disjointed notes that hinted at obsessive thoughts about control and dominance. "That was the moment we knew we were close," said Sheriff Huffman. "He wasn't just a myth anymore. He was real, he was flesh and blood, and he was scared." A town on edge. The incident only heightened both hope and tension within the community. People began locking their doors even earlier in the evening. Suspicion flared every time a stranger so much as glanced at a teenager, and tempers grew short as the hunt dragged on. The national media descended upon Midtown, turning quiet streets into hotbeds of cameras and microphones. Commentators speculated wildly about the predator's identity. Was he a loner, a respected member of the community living a double life, or someone drifting just far enough from town to avoid attention? "I don't care if the cameras think this makes good TV," said one father during a town meeting. "All I care about is making sure that monster doesn't touch another kid ever again." Closing in bit by bit, the pieces began to fall into place. Forensic evidence from the truck linked it to one of the abandoned houses connected to a prior victim. Witness statements began to paint a clearer picture of the predator's patterns, allowing detectives to predict his hunting grounds more accurately. Psychologists on the case noted that his sudden public slip-up suggested he might be losing his nerve, making it only a matter of time before he made a fatal mistake. "It's like hunting a shadow," said Detective Harper, "but even shadows can't outrun the dawn forever." As the weeks passed, the tension reached a boiling point. Law enforcement and the community both knew that the predator's days of anonymity were numbered. For the first time, it no longer felt like a question of if they would catch him, it was a question of when. A turning point. The discovery of fabric and human remains. It was another frostbitten morning in the outskirts of Midtown when a team of investigators approached a deteriorating house tucked out of sight near a snow-lined boundary. The ramshackle structure, hidden behind dense brambles of thorny underbrush and long-forgotten trails, was one of several locations flagged for inspection in the expanded manhunt. To most onlookers, it was just another abandoned building waiting to collapse into obscurity. But to the seasoned investigators on Sheriff Michael Huffman's team, the house felt different the moment they stepped inside. What started as a routine sweep quickly turned into a groundbreaking moment in the investigation, a discovery that would change the dynamics of their hunt for the elusive predator. The grisly find, inside the wooden walls. The house's interior was a somber tableau, peeling wallpaper, dirt-streaked windows, and the unmistakable weight of stillness that came from years of neglect. Officers moved cautiously, their boots crunching on debris as flashlights swept through the dim, dust-filled air. At first glance, the house seemed no more suspicious than the dozens of others they had already searched. The ground floor showed signs of an old life, broken furniture, stacks of faded newspapers, and a crumbling fireplace that hadn't roared in decades. Yet one officer noticed something odd, a distinct patch of flooring in the back corner that appeared freshly disturbed. Kneeling near the spot, Officer Carla Brooks gently brushed away the top layer of dirt and debris, her gloved hand uncovering a frayed piece of fabric just barely peeking through the loose soil. As she pulled it free, everyone in the room fell silent. It wasn't just a piece of harmless cloth, it was eerily similar to the bindings used on Jack Miller during his horrifying ordeal. "As soon as I saw it, I felt this chill run down my spine," Brooks later recalled. It was the same kind of material Jack described being tied up with. Same texture, same rough industrial weave. We all knew right then and there this place wasn't just abandoned, it was part of his hunting ground. Their discovery didn't end there. Digging beneath the fabric revealed patches of moist, darkened soil, and the faint, unmistakable outlines of something more sinister began to emerge. The team worked methodically but urgently, uncovering fragment after fragment of brittle human bone. What lay beneath the floor wasn't just troubling, it was confirmation of the predator's horrifying methods, and the many lives he had claimed in the shadows. The evidence that broke the silence. The fabric strip, later analyzed in forensic labs, matched the bindings found in other crime scenes connected to the predator, but perhaps more haunting was the discovery of the human remains. Forensic experts determined that the bones belonged to at least two different individuals, both teenagers. This was a heart-crushing revelation for the investigators, a stark reminder of the lives lost in the predator's cruel grasp, lives buried in shallow graves and masked under the veil of forgotten houses. "The floorboards felt like they were concealing years of pain," confessed Detective Jim Harper, who oversaw the crime scene. "We weren't just looking at a coincidence. This was deliberate. This was someone who believed he would never get caught." The findings were critical, not just for the emotional burden they carried, but for the way they revitalized the investigation. Up until this point, the predator had maintained near-flawless anonymity, operating with eerie precision and leaving behind barely a trace. The fabric and bones, however, peeled back some of the layers of mystery. There was no longer a question of whether or not the predator had been there. It was proof he had operated within that very location. Tracing the predator through his rituals. Through the careful reconstruction of evidence at the scene, a horrifying picture of the predator's cold, calculated process began to emerge. This wasn't the work of a disorganized killer acting out of impulse. This was someone who meticulously staged every detail to maintain control. Investigators noticed with unsettling consistency that homemade wooden frames were present at nearly all the identified crime sites. In this particular house, they found fragments of one such frame carelessly discarded in the far corner of the room. It was built crudely from pieces of scrap lumber and appeared strongly anchored into the floorboards. Forensic analysis revealed blood splatter traces on the beams, confirming its purpose as a sinister tool of restraint for his young victims. "He wasn't just killing them," said Dr. Carol Ridley, the FBI profiler assisting in the case. "This was about complete domination. Everything he left behind, everything he used, fabric, tools, makeshift frames, fit into a methodical ritual designed to strip his victims of power and inflict despair. To him, this wasn't chaos, it was control, a glimpse into his mind through the clues." One of the most chilling discoveries at the site was the presence of carefully hidden personal items belonging to the victims. Rings, bracelets, and even a dog tag were found scattered behind the house, buried shallowly under mounds of soggy leaves. These small items were likely trophies, symbols the predator kept to either relive the satisfaction of his crimes or to remind himself of his accomplishments. For the investigators, these items served as somber truths, proof that the boys were real, that they had lived, that they had dreams, and that their lives had been senselessly taken. But for law enforcement, they became breadcrumbs, a way to identify victims and, hopefully, trace the predator's movements through his trophies. Midtown's reaction, a community on the brink. When word spread about the discoveries at the house, Midtown reeled in shock. Though the community had already endured a dark cloud of uncertainty for 2 long years, the confirmation of human remains turned quiet fear into vocal outrage. Families of the missing boys gathered at the police department demanding justice, while school teachers, shop owners, and clergy members organized vigils to honor the lives lost. "Knowing those boys didn't get to come home, it broke something in all of us," said Pastor Rick Arnold, who led a service one evening at Midtown Chapel. "But it also lit a fire. Whoever did this needs to be stopped, and I know this town will do whatever it takes to see that happen." Forensic sparks action. The bones, combined with the fabric and traces of scattered blood, finally gave investigators the break they had been waiting for. DNA analysis linked remains at the house to one of the boys who had disappeared nearly a year earlier, bolstering the idea that the predator had established a network of sites for his crimes. Meanwhile, the presence of the same type of fabric across multiple scenes gave investigators valuable insight into the materials the predator regularly used, potentially his work connections, or his preferred suppliers. In one chilling turn, officers uncovered a record of purchases in a nearby hardware store where a man matching the predator's description had bought rolls of similar fabric weeks before Jack Miller's escape. With every finding, the net surrounding Midtown's haunting shadow tightened. Hope reborn. For both law enforcement and the people of Midtown, the discovery of the fabric and human remains marked a turning point. While it laid bare the horrifying scope of the predator's actions, it also reinvigorated the sense that justice was within reach. Overnight, these pieces of evidence became symbols of hope, physical proof that the predator's network wasn't impenetrable, that cracks in his careful routine were beginning to show. And for Sheriff Huffman, one thing was crystal clear. This monster may have buried his secrets under dirt and wood, but we're going to dig up every last one of them and make sure no other family suffers like this again. The fabric, the bones, and the house itself told a clear message. The predator's trail wasn't cold anymore, it was burning hot, and the hunt to find him was finally veering toward its climactic conclusion. The terrifying encounter, face to face with the predator. It was a cold, moonlit night in early February when the Midtown police staged what would come to be known as one of their most nerve-wracking operations. Acting on a tip passed along by a local farmer, officers set up a covert surveillance team near a secluded trailhead at the edge of the Pine Ridge Forest. This trail, overgrown and seemingly forgotten, was known to lead to one of the predator's suspected hunting grounds. The farmer claimed to have seen a red pickup truck parked nearby several nights earlier, only to vanish hours later. For the investigators chasing this shadow for 2 long years, the possibility of finally catching him was too great to ignore. What began as a quiet, focused operation quickly spiraled into chaos when they came closer to their target than they'd ever imagined. A cold watch in the woods. The officers arrived well before sunset, taking care to park their vehicles out of sight and move on foot toward the trailhead. They carried thermal goggles, long-range radios, and restraint equipment, ready for what could very well be an ambush or sudden confrontation. The area had become notorious for its eerie quiet, and the lingering knowledge that other boys had once walked these same grounds with their predator hung heavy in the unusually chilled air. "It felt like the stillness was alive," recalled Detective Jim Harper. "Every breath I took sounded too loud, like the forest itself was holding its breath." The plan was simple. Wait in the shadows and hope the predator returned to the scene. A team of 46 officers scattered in strategic positions along the trail. 2 FBI agents were stationed closer to the forest's entrance, while Sheriff Huffman himself stayed at a central command post, directing the operation remotely. Everyone knew the stakes were high. The predator was methodical, endlessly cautious, and never stayed in one area too long. There might not be another chance if he slipped away again. The first signs of trouble. 3 hours into the stakeout, movement alerted one of the perimeter officers. Through the darkness, he spotted the glimmer of headlights bouncing down the desolate path. The truck moved slowly, the rumble of its engine muffled by the dense trees. A beat-up red pickup. The hearts of everyone on the team began to pound as the officers reported what they were seeing to command. "Red truck entering the location," the officer whispered over his radio. "Single occupant. Matches description. Stand by for confirmation." From their hidden vantage points, officers observed as the truck pulled to a stop just beyond the last bend in the trail. The man inside was partially concealed by the dashboard, his features obscured in the dim light. As he exited the vehicle, however, his face came into partial view, average-looking, unremarkable, almost painfully normal. Every piece of Jack Miller's description flooded back into the minds of the officers. They were looking at him. This was the predator. The man walked toward the edge of the woods, casually but with an undeniable sense of purpose. He carried a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder. From his movements it was clear he wasn't expecting to be followed. He likely thought the area was as desolate and secure as ever. But he was wrong. Closing in, the officers moved cautiously, determined to avoid giving him any sense of their presence. Every step forward was deliberate, every radio whisper soft enough to be drowned out by the faint rustling of the trees. When the man knelt near a clearing and began removing items from his bag, a roll of the same industrial fabric used in his previous crimes, paired with hand tools of a sinister nature, the officers knew it was time to act. "Stand by!" Sheriff Huffman's voice calmly crackled over the radios. "Do not let him leave the perimeter." The team split into two groups to encircle the man, cutting off all potential escape routes. The minutes stretched agonizingly as they closed in from both sides, their weapons ready but fingers steady on the triggers. Everyone knew that this moment was the closest they'd ever been to stopping him, but also the most dangerous encounter they had ever faced. An unexpected twist. Just as the officers moved into position to corner him, the predator froze, as if sensing something was wrong. Without warning, he turned sharply, scanning the darkness with a look of suspicion that sent chills down the spines of the team. He wasn't like other criminals who might panic in these situations. His face didn't show fear, it showed calculation. "Something's off," Detective Harper muttered to himself as he watched. Then it happened. With a sudden burst of energy, the man bolted into the trees, his duffel bag left behind in the clearing. The officers scrambled, sprinting after him, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The predator moved with terrifying speed and agility, weaving through the dense brush as though he had rehearsed this escape countless times before. The chase became frantic. Radios crackled with updates as team members tried to predict where he was heading. But the forest was vast and shadowed, favoring the man who knew every corner of it. "It was like chasing a phantom," one officer admitted later. "He wasn't just running, he was disappearing." The elusive escape. Despite their best efforts, the officers lost him. The predator broke through a section of the woods that led toward a steep ravine, too treacherous for the team to follow without the risk of injury. He had outmaneuvered them again, slipping into the night like the shadow he had always been. When the officers returned to the clearing, frustration hung heavy in the air. They were so close, closer than ever before, but close wasn't enough. However, their pursuit hadn't been entirely fruitless. The bag that spoke volumes. Inside the duffel bag the predator had abandoned, investigators found a treasure trove of chilling evidence. There were rolls of frayed fabric, lengths of rope, a claw hammer stained with what could have been old blood, and a collection of folded-up maps marked with certain abandoned locations around Midtown and beyond. Most disturbing of all was a notebook filled with scribbled entries in sharp, erratic handwriting. What it revealed was as unsettling as it was invaluable. The pages were littered with fragmented thoughts, obsessive musings about control, and detailed notes about his targets. Some pages appeared to be outlines, what he called plans. This was no impulsive killer. The writing confirmed what investigators had long suspected. This was a man who thrived on precision and control, someone who treated his crimes like puzzles to be solved and reenacted. To him, these weren't just victims, said Dr. Carol Ridley, the profile expert. They were characters in a story he was writing over and over again. It wasn't about chaos, it was about rehearsing the same twisted performance repeatedly. The frustration of near victory, the forest betrayal, the predator's quick-footed escape, and the evidence left behind rattled the officers. For many, it was proof that he was human, capable of making mistakes. Yet, for Sheriff Huffman, it was also a reminder of how dangerous he remained. "He's scared now," Huffman reassured his team. You saw how he ran. He's not untouchable anymore. He's breakable, and we'll break him." The people of Midtown, hearing of the near capture, were equal parts relieved and on edge. The predator had shown himself, revealed his face, and even left behind invaluable evidence, but the fact that he was still out there kept the community tightly bound in vigilance. A lingering darkness. The encounter, though not the ultimate victory they had hoped for, marked a turning point. The predator knew he could no longer operate with the impunity he had relied on for years. The officers were closing in. The townsfolk had united against him. He was no longer the invisible force haunting Midtown. He was flesh and blood, a man who could be stopped. And for the law enforcement officers who had watched him disappear into the trees, there was one truth they held on to as they prepared for the next phase of their pursuit. Shadows can run, but they can't hide forever. The killer unmasked, a face behind the fear. After months of exhaustive searching, frustrating slip-ups, and near misses, the elusive predator who had stalked Midtown for over 2 years had finally been identified. In a crescendo of unexpected breakthroughs and meticulous investigative work, the hunt that had terrorized a small town and mystified law enforcement was nearing its end. The moment the predator's identity came to light sent shockwaves through both the task force and the community. He was no longer a faceless shadow skulking in the darkness. He was a man with a name, a history, and a horrifying double life. The breakthrough. The massive manhunt took a decisive turn after officers uncovered critical evidence from the predator's abandoned duffel bag during their near-capture operation. Among the disturbing discoveries, like the blood-stained tools and fabric strips, was a notebook, its pages filled with cryptic notes, sketch diagrams, and disturbing musings about control and domination. But between the dark and erratic lines were hints about the man behind the crimes. While he'd avoided leaving fingerprints or samples of DNA in his hideouts, one entry in the notebook held the key, a list that included hardware stores, gas stations, and other mundane locations he had visited to gather materials. One particular receipt crumpled into the bag led investigators to a hardware store in a neighboring town. With the help of surveillance footage from the store's security cameras, the officers spotted him, the suspected predator. His features matched Jack Miller's description perfectly. Mid to late 30s, average build, unremarkable face, someone who wouldn't have been memorable under normal circumstances. "Seeing him on that footage for the first time was surreal," said Detective Carla Brooks. "In your head, someone so monstrous feels larger than life. But there he was, standing in line buying supplies like he was just any other guy." The name on the receipt, confirmed through the transaction records, was David Conrad, an ordinary monster. David Conrad was an individual who, at first glance, could be considered painfully ordinary. Born and raised in a struggling working-class family, he'd spent most of his life moving between small Midwestern towns, jumping from one blue-collar job to another. He worked as a handyman, a construction worker, and even briefly as a mechanic. People who knew him described him as quiet, polite, and just sort of there, someone whose presence never left much of an impression. But beneath the facade of normalcy lay a man deeply scarred by trauma and fueled by a violent, terrifying pathology. Investigators uncovered fragments of his troubled history, a childhood marked by neglect and severe abuse. Conrad's father, an alcoholic prone to violent outbursts, had reportedly beaten him from a young age. His mother, unable to protect him or herself, left the family when Conrad was just 10 years old. The abandonment deepened the bitterness and distrust that he harbored toward others. By his teenage years, Conrad had withdrawn entirely from his peers, choosing instead to spend time in abandoned buildings on the fringes of town, structures eerily reminiscent of those he would later turn into his personal crime scenes. Teachers remembered him as unremarkable academically, but noted his unusual habit of disappearing for days at a time, and an unnerving detachment from everyone around him, living in plain sight. For law enforcement, one of the most chilling aspects of the case was how Conrad had managed to operate in plain sight for so long. He wasn't a drifter living off the grid, as many had initially theorized. Conrad had rented a small house just outside of Midtown's southern boundary. To his neighbors, he was no more than a quiet recluse who kept to himself. He mowed his lawn, waved shyly to the occasional passerby, and never drew unwanted attention. "He was the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about," said Amanda Vickers, who lived 2 blocks over from Conrad. "The guy who drives an old truck to the hardware store and keeps to himself. He wasn't creepy, he was forgettable. And that's what makes all of this so terrifying." Further investigations revealed that Conrad's various jobs, particularly in construction and handyman work, had given him access to numerous abandoned houses across the region. He had taken these jobs not out of financial necessity, but to scout locations for his crimes. Each site he used was methodically chosen, far from prying eyes, easy to access, and difficult for anyone to stumble upon. The takedown plan. Once Conrad's identity was confirmed, Sheriff Huffman and the assembled task force realized they couldn't afford another close call or escape. This time, they had to be certain. The task force pored over Conrad's patterns, habits, and locations he had frequented. Surveillance teams were put in place around his home, while another team covertly tracked his movements. "We weren't just waiting for him to slip up," said Detective Harper. "We were putting together a net so tight he wouldn't even realize he was trapped until it was too late." Conrad's most consistent activity was his handling of materials and supplies at a scrapyard just outside of town, a routine he used to maintain his cover. Officers decided this would be their opportunity to act. Teams were stationed out of sight for days until it became clear that Conrad planned to make another trip out to one of his hunting grounds. The stage was set: the arrest. The operation to bring Conrad into custody was carried out with precision and intensity. On a damp, overcast morning, as Conrad's red pickup began its slow crawl up a dirt road toward the outskirts of town, police vehicles converged on all sides. A helicopter hovered above as officers blocked his exit in every direction. For a moment it seemed as though he might try to run again. His hands tightened on the wheel, the truck revved ominously, and tension gripped every officer in the area. But when Conrad realized the futility of escaping, he let the truck stall in place. He stepped out slowly, hands raised, his face devoid of emotion. "Not a word," one officer remarked after the arrest. He climbed out of the truck like he had just accepted it. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. It was blank, like his brain had already checked out. The end of the shadow. For the first time in over 2 years, the predator who had haunted the nightmares of Midtown parents and children, who had evaded capture time and time again, was finally in custody. His arrest brought a collective sigh of relief to a town that had spent so long watching over its shoulder. While residents could finally feel some semblance of safety, few could ignore the chilling reality. This man had walked among them, blending entirely into their picture of small-town life. He wasn't a stranger hiding in an unknown corner of the country. He was right there with them all along, a product of their own streets. But as the shadow of David Conrad began to dissipate, another question lingered in Midtown's collective mind. How could they prevent anything like this from ever happening again? A face behind the fear. David Conrad's unmasking was not just the turning point for the case, it was a moment of reckoning for Midtown. The clean-cut, quiet figure sitting in the police interrogation room was a stark reminder that monsters don't always have wild eyes or gruesome scars. Sometimes, they look like the man next door, nodding at you as you pass, hiding their darkness behind a thin veil of normalcy. For the officers, families, and survivors, the relief was short-lived. Closure would only come when justice was served. For Conrad, there would be no escape, not this time. This was the beginning of the end for a man who had thought himself invisible, and an end to the nightmare for a town that would never forget the darkness it survived. The chilling confession. Inside the predator's mind, David Conrad sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, a steel table separating him from the 2 detectives who had spent years chasing his shadow. His demeanor was disturbingly calm, his hands cuffed in front of him, resting casually as if he were sitting through a routine traffic stop and not being questioned for some of the most heinous crimes Midtown had ever seen. The room was silent, save for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Moments like this, the confrontation with a suspected killer, often brought tension, resistance, even tears. But Conrad exhibited none of that. He didn't request a lawyer, nor did he protest his arrest. He didn't even flinch when the detectives laid out the evidence tying him to the crimes. Instead, as Detective Jim Harper leaned forward and said, "It's over, David. We know what you've done." Conrad smiled faintly, leaned back in his chair, and began to talk. What followed was a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who had evaded capture, manipulated his surroundings, and taken the lives of so many, all while blending so seamlessly into the fabric of a small town. Breaking the silence. At first, Conrad's voice was low and monotone, almost as if he were recounting mundane details rather than describing years of calculated violence. "You all make it sound so dramatic," he began, looking past the detectives as though his thoughts were far away. It wasn't some grand plan, it was instinct. The detectives exchanged a glance but let him continue. They knew pushing too hard could make him clam up, and right now, they needed answers. Needed closure, for the families, for Jack Miller, and for Midtown itself. "You want to know why I did it?" Conrad asked, tilting his head slightly as if testing their patience. "Because I could, that's it. No bigger reason, no sob story about revenge or some grand purpose. They were easy." Detective Harper fought to keep his composure. "Who's they? David? The boys? The ones whose lives you stole? Were they just easy?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. David's eyes flicked to Harper for the briefest moment. "They trusted too much," he said flatly. "That's why it worked. They all wanted something. Money, attention, adventure. A little push, a little nudge, and they'd follow. That's the thing about kids these days. They think nothing bad could ever happen to them." His words hung in the air like a toxic fog, suffocating in their cold simplicity. For David Conrad, the lives he took weren't tragedies or acts of brutality. They were transactions, moments of control and power that fed his twisted sense of fulfillment. Detailing the crimes. Over the course of hours, Conrad described his actions with alarming clarity. He spoke of how he selected his targets, his process, and the sense of satisfaction he derived from each success. "I didn't pick them randomly," he explained. "That's sloppy, amateurish. You have to watch, take your time, figure out their routine, figure out what makes them tick. Some of them were just waiting to be taken. It was written all over their faces." The detectives pressed him for details, and what Conrad revealed was both horrifying and methodical. He described how he frequented places like arcades, parks, and even the local gaming cafe where he'd first approached Jack Miller. He would strike up conversations, carefully disarming his targets with charm and a well-practiced casual demeanor. "I gave them exactly what they needed," he said matter-of-factly. "For the quiet ones I listened. For the confident ones I pretended to admire them. Kids are predictable. They want to feel special, and I made them feel that way." "Is that why you lured them, David?" Detective Carla Brooks interjected, her voice just above a whisper. "To make them feel special." Conrad smirked, a flash of something dark crossing his face. "No, I lured them because I wanted to. And they didn't stop me. That's on them." Both detectives stiffened at the outright callousness of his statement. There was no remorse, no conflicted humanity beneath the surface. For Conrad, each victim was simply a means to an end, the ritual of control. As Conrad delved deeper into his crimes, his tone shifted, becoming almost boastful. It was clear that he took pride in his ability to manipulate and dominate his victims. He spoke of the careful preparation that went into creating his hunting grounds in abandoned houses, the tools he used, and the rituals that brought him a sick satisfaction. "The frames," he said, referencing the makeshift wooden structures investigators had found at multiple crime scenes. "They weren't just for restraint, they were necessary. Once they were bound, once they couldn't fight back, that's when I felt it. The calm, like I'd finally silenced all the noise." "What noise, David?" Harper asked, leaning forward, his voice tight with restraint. "Life," Conrad replied shortly. "Other people, expectations, judgment. When I was with them, when I had total control, none of it mattered. It was quiet. Perfect." Harper stood and walked to the corner of the room, suppressing the urge to lash out, not just at Conrad but at the darkness that seemed to ooze from his words. Meanwhile, Brooks pressed on. "And Jack Miller? Why did he survive?" she asked. "Why let him escape?" Conrad paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. For the first time a hint of something, hesitation, frustration, crept into his expression. "He wasn't supposed to leave," Conrad admitted, "but I got sloppy, too comfortable." He shook his head slightly. "I was done with him. Bored, maybe. I let my guard down and the kid ran. Smart kid, I'll give him that. No regrets." When asked if he felt remorse for what he had done, Conrad's response was immediate and chilling. "No," he said simply. "They're gone and I'm here. Feeling bad won't change that. Besides, they're the ones who put themselves in that position, not me." "You manipulated them, David. You took children and turned them into pawns in whatever sick games you were playing," Brooks said, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you even understand the lives you destroyed? The families you shattered?" For the first time, Conrad laughed, a short, bitter sound that sent a wave of unease through the room. "You want me to feel bad so you can sleep better at night?" he said, his voice mocking. "Sorry, that's not how this works." The weight of the confession. By the time Conrad finished speaking, both detectives felt the full weight of what they had heard. The confession wasn't just a recounting of events, it was a window into a mind devoid of empathy, driven by a hunger for control and domination. Every word Conrad spoke was a reminder of the evil that had been hiding in plain sight for years. When they finally left the room, Harper turned to Brooks, his face pale. "I thought catching him would bring some kind of closure," he said quietly. "But after hearing him talk, I don't think this town will ever feel whole again." Brooks nodded, her jaw tight. "We caught the monster. Now it's time to make sure he never hurts anyone again." A chilling legacy. In the days following Conrad's confession, his words reverberated through Midtown. For the victims' families, knowing the details of how their loved ones were taken was agonizing, but it also brought a twisted sense of closure. The monster now had a face, a name, and he would never be able to hurt anyone again. As David Conrad awaited trial, the people of Midtown wrestled with the reality of his actions and the questions he left behind. How had someone so monstrous gone unnoticed for so long? Could they ever truly heal from the darkness he had brought upon their community? For now, the only thing Midtown knew for certain was this: they would never forget David Conrad's chilling confession, nor the silent screams of the lives he had stolen. The end of a nightmare. For Midtown, the capture of David Conrad marked the close of a chapter drenched in fear and suffering. After over 2 harrowing years of disappearances, whispers behind closed doors, neighborhood vigils, and desperate searches, the predator who had haunted their town was finally chained behind bars. But as much as Midtown breathed a collective sigh of relief, it was clear that the healing process would be neither swift nor simple. The monster was caught, but his legacy of horror lingered in every corner of the community he had shattered. The trial that brought light to the darkest shadows. The trial of David Conrad was one of the most highly publicized events in the state. For weeks, families of the victims, law enforcement, and journalists crowded into the courthouse, while the world outside watched through their television screens. It wasn't just a criminal trial. It was an attempt to reckon with an evil that seemed almost incomprehensible. For the families of the boys Conrad had murdered, it was their only chance to speak for loved ones who no longer could. The case against Conrad was airtight. Prosecutors brought forward overwhelming evidence. DNA samples found in his hideouts, materials tied to his crimes, and an unrelenting confession he had given during his interrogation. Forensic paths established clear links between the human remains found in the abandoned houses and the boys who had gone missing. A chain of receipts, surveillance footage, and testimony painted a precise picture of his methodical approach to murder. Most damning of all was Jack Miller, the lone survivor. Jack testified with a level of raw bravery that moved the courtroom to tears. He described in excruciating detail how Conrad had deceived him with his easy charm, how he ended up tied to one of the predator's crude wooden frames, and how he clawed his way out of the nightmare. Jack's voice wavered at times, but he never stopped. He was there to represent those who couldn't stand in that courtroom, to bring their memory to life and demand justice for them. "I escaped," Jack told the court, his voice thick with emotion. "But they didn't. I'm here because I owe it to them to make sure he never does this to anyone else." It was a moment that left the courtroom silent. Even Conrad, sitting coolly at his defense table, could not meet the survivor's piercing gaze. Sentencing the monster. After weeks of testimonies, cross-examinations, and replays of horrifying evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts. David Conrad was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault, among other charges. When the judge handed down the sentence, death by lethal injection, there was no outburst, no dramatic finale. Conrad didn't plead for mercy or show any signs of remorse. He simply stared ahead, an almost hollow figure, as though his own fate was irrelevant to him. But for Midtown, it wasn't irrelevant, not by any measure. For the families, friends, and law enforcement officers, Conrad's sentence brought closure in the only way possible. He would never hurt another soul again. Still, some questioned whether true justice could ever be served. "Nothing will bring my son back," said Linda Parker, the mother of one of Conrad's victims, outside the courthouse. "But at least now we can finally sleep at night knowing that man is gone." The legacy left behind. Even with Conrad gone, Midtown couldn't rid itself of the scars he had left behind. The abandoned houses he turned into crime scenes remained stark reminders of his reign of terror. Some residents called for them to be demolished, unable to bear the thought of living so close to those sites. Others wanted them preserved as a memorial to the boys who lost their lives there, a cautionary marker of what had once occurred in the shadows of their town. "My son played on that street," said one father, pointing to a dilapidated house where remains had been found. "How do I explain to him what happened there? How do I explain that kind of evil even exists?" The most haunting fact for the community wasn't just that Conrad had killed, it was that he had lived among them, entirely unnoticed. He was the quiet man in the red truck who nodded at neighbors as he passed. He was the unassuming handyman who fixed fences and patched roofs. He was the invisible predator hiding in plain sight. In response, Midtown vowed to be more vigilant. Churches started hosting safety workshops, schools revamped their stranger danger programs, and neighborhood watches became fiercer than ever. Parents who once let their kids roam free now held tighter to their hands. Trust, a cornerstone of small-town life, had been shattered, and rebuilding it seemed almost impossible. "We can't change what happened," said Sheriff Michael Huffman during a memorial service for the victims, "but we can do everything in our power to make sure it never happens again." Jack Miller's fight for hope. For Jack Miller, the trial wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Still a teenager but carrying the weight of a survivor, Jack became determined to turn his trauma into action. He started speaking at schools and community events, raising awareness about the dangers of trusting strangers and the importance of personal safety. Though still grappling with his own nightmares, he refused to let what happened define him. "Evil doesn't win," he told a crowd of parents and students at his high school. "It thinks it does. It thinks it's smart and powerful, but in the end, what wins is us. Survivors, families, people who refuse to give up." Jack's courage became a rallying cry for Midtown, a reminder that even in their darkest moments, they could rebuild. He refused to let Conrad's axe serve as the town's only story. Instead, he insisted on writing a new narrative, one of unity, resilience, and hope. A town that refuses to forget. As time moved on, Midtown began the long, painful process of healing. Memorials were erected for the boys who had lost their lives, their names etched in stone as a reminder that they would never be forgotten. Candlelight vigils continued to be held, not to mourn the past, but to honor it, to reclaim the power that Conrad had taken from them. In the center of town, a plaque was placed beneath an ancient oak tree, bearing the words, "In memory of those we lost and the hope we carry forward, we stand together." For the families and residents, the wounds didn't disappear, but they learned to live with them, leaning on each other for strength. Though the shadow of David Conrad would never truly vanish, Midtown found light in the lessons born out of its suffering. The final chapter. David Conrad's name eventually faded from the headlines, but for those who lived through his terror, the memories remained sharp. The end of the nightmare didn't mean forgetting, it meant learning, growing, and ensuring that evil like his could never take root again. "Evil doesn't just happen in dark alleys or big cities," said Detective Harper during a town-wide safety seminar. "It hides in plain sight. And that's why we have to stay vigilant, for ourselves, for our families, and for each other." And so, as the years went on, Midtown became something more than it had ever been. Not just a quiet suburb, but a vigilant community. A town that refused to let its tragedy define it. A town that faced its darkest nightmare and stood tall in its wake. The nightmare ended, but Midtown's resolve to protect its own would never fade.